is always a good thing. So today I want to talk to us about the influence we have on our children in terms of what they do, what they engage in, and ultimately what they become. There's a correlation between exposure and opportunity that they eventually glean and pull from, that they make life decisions around hobbies, around organizations, around sports, around majors in college if they should decide to go to college, or even possibly eventual careers. If I think back on all the things that I was exposed to via my parents, via my father, much of that is evidenced in kind of what I'm doing today. And I always like to sort of think to myself personally, but also for my children or even folks in general. Imagine a person had a tremendous talent. They could have been a great ice skater. They could have been a great trumpeter. They could have been a great archaeologist. They could have been a great writer, right? But for some reason in their pathway of life, their coming of age process, they just never were exposed to it. All the latent talent that's within us as beautiful human beings, that circumstances just did not allow us to be tapped into. We didn't get exposed to it, or maybe our parents couldn't afford to have us engaged in that activity, and we never became the great opera singer or the great poet or the great concerto celloist, whatever the case may be, right? But as parents, it is our job, it is our responsibility beyond care, beyond nurturance, beyond love, beyond safety and those kinds of things, to also glean and to look in them, to look literally into them, to see what natural talents are manifesting themselves, what innate skill sets do they have, and then more importantly, how can we advance that, right? How can we seek to bring that out of them in constructive kinds of ways, largely by engaging those activities or putting them in front of folks who have certain expertise and can tap into that for them. So our children ultimately become what we expose them to, right? They ultimately become what we expose to. So for example, you'll know pretty early on if your son or daughter has a certain kind of physicality for athleticism. You probably have watched them since they could move, right? When they're able to set up, maybe they did that a little bit earlier, or when they were able to walk, they did that a little earlier. And you notice when they're a toddler, how they move and how they bounce and how they sort of jump and traverse furniture and all those kinds of things. And you see a certain kind of agility in your beautiful season. You go, all right, we might have something here, right? And then your first inclination is to sign them up for whatever sport you did or wish you did. But yeah, that's all a part of it, is sort of getting them out there in the sport world. And you notice, especially if you have multiple children, that some of them just have more dexterity, more agility, more eye-hand coordination than some of your other children. And a part of what you then do is expose them to things that are of an athletic or physical or tactile kind of realm. That's certainly understandable. But there's other latent talents that are perhaps more difficult than what you can observe when you're looking at your beautiful children, right? Talent like art. I have a couple of children who are really drawn to the creative side of things. And as parents, we'll put, to keep them busy, we'll give them paper and crayons, and you realize that some folks scribble and can't stay within the lines, and you're like, that's okay, baby, right? But the other ones, they mesh in colors, their figures tend to resemble something at a young age. And that lets you know, hey, that's a skill set. We don't know if it's quite a talent or a high interest, but at least something they can do. And so we provide those kinds of exposures to them. There's also, when you observe them, particularly in school settings, right? What brings them out, especially if you have introverted children or shy children, what brings them out, right? Is it music? Is it a certain subject that they seem to be drawn to? One of my sons, who eventually became an opera singer, an opera major of all sorts, he was very shy, very reserved, kind of very much in the cut. He was going through his body growth and his baby weight, and he just kind of stayed in the back a little bit until I observed him in a class that was acting related, theater related. And I saw him come to life, and I saw him almost take on a different persona. and become this sort of bubbly, vivacious, gregarious kind of little young dude, right? And that let me know that, okay, he's finding a way to express himself, to engage with others, to sort of lean into that kind of crew. And that was a pathway for him. And so we supported singing classes, dancing classes for him. He was trying out for the school plays, did very well, and then eventually tracked in the art space and continued to do theater, musical theater, and eventually opera as a major. And now he's a creative type. He's a writer, and that was kind of his pathway. But it was something that we saw and something that we encouraged and supported, both literally and financially and in resources. So how do we glean our children to understand what their pathway and talents might be? Now, the core of why I wanted to really do this presentation is one thing that is difficult to see early on. I'm talking 4 or 5, is their mental aptitude, particularly in the space of math. If you look at STEM, the diversification of STEM is of a major concern for the nation. The United States is increasingly becoming more and more diverse. However, if you look at STEM fields, they are almost 89% white, 11% people of color. Obviously, they're dominated by males, and I understand there's nuance tied to that. But how do we identify high aptitude in STEM, science, particularly math, early on in our beautiful children as a way of then teeing up a pathway for them to kind of start that early? You certainly can discover it in kindergarten with number associations, shapes, blocks, those kind of things. And then in elementary school, that'll come out then. But are there strategies to sort of glean their capacity and aptitude in math? So one thing I did, and I'm recommending this as a parent tip or a strategy, is to explore math aptitude at the dinner table with your children, right? And no matter what age they are. So here's what I did. They were all born, there was about 5 of them at the house, right? All ranging in different kind of ages. And then I put them through a math simulation to get a sense of where they were, right? So I said, okay, what is 2 plus 3? And they all kind of in their own fingers, and that's 5, right? But one of my sons, he kind of peeked up, all right? Because normally we would do jokes or riddles or puzzle kind of things at the dinner table just to kind of make it fun for everyone. But I could see him beginning to lean in. And then I said, okay, well, let's keep with it. What's 7 plus 4? Right? Get a little bit higher up in the numbers. Well, that's 11. All right, we're dealing with double digit kinds of numbers. And then we would do some subtraction. What's 21 minus 6? That's 15, right? And I could tell as I kind of went up in the number count, certain ones of my seeds would just kind of tune out, right? They were like, nah, I don't want to really mess with it, right? It wasn't of interest to them. But one was just leaning in, right? He wanted to be challenged. He wanted the next challenge. He wanted to be first to answer it. And you could tell he was excited about that, right? So I said, all right, let's make it a little bit more complex. I said, all right, if 2 plus 3 equals 5, what is 2 plus x equals 5? What does x stand for? So we're using the same variance in raw numbers, but now we're introducing something that's non-numerical, in this case, a letter, which is sort of infancy algebra. So 2 plus 3 equals 5, 2 plus x equals 5. What does x represent? And so in his mind, he had to make a shift, the same number, but now being represented by a different variable. And by this time, my other kids just kind of tuned out. But this one just leaned in and his mind got to working, right? And he says, it's 3. And I said, okay. And so now we took it to another variable. I said, okay, if we know x represents 3, b plus x equals 7. And then we stop there and his mind is working. His mind is working. His mind is working. He says b represents 4. And so he was able to take an abstract thought from logical math and associate something that was unknown by using the construct of the formula of the equation. And he was able to go from numbers to what represented numbers in variables that had no meaning until you give it context. And his mind was working. His mind was working. And I realized very early on that my son, that particular son, had a high aptitude, or an aptitude at least, for math and science. And I was able to discover that pretty young. I'm thinking 4 or 5 years old. And then I was able to kind of ensure that he pathwayed, as long as he had interest in the math and science. And so his pathway was Odyssey of the mind, which is problem solving. He leaned particularly towards the robotics, the mechanical side of things that has both physics and math orientation to it. And that was the space where he blossomed. And so I had sons that blossomed in the arts, daughters and sons that blossomed in sport. And then my one particular son blossomed in the space of science. And so he graduated, is now an undergrad, a robotics major, doing some work for a corporation here locally. He works for a tech company learning coding, but all of that was a part of his pathway. And that pathway was supported and certainly discovered at a very young age. So in the spirit of J4, just wanted to share the underscore the emphasis of gleaning your children's signs, right? Gleaning things that they are drawn to, right? If you put them in a room of things that are different, dolls, clothing, machinery, video games, toys, what are they drawn to, right? And that they're telling us in their own unique, youthful, young way, what is of appeal to them, right? And then as parents, how do we then encourage that, support that, nurture that as a way of them being connected to a passion source that's also coupled with a talent, a skill set, and then who knows what that can become. But the dynamic of parenting is not just provision, care, love, protection. It is also the next phase, which is trying to understand the individual uniqueness of our individual children, or if we have many children, what's important to them. And then in partnership with your spouse, or in partnership with your personal village and community, how do we then support that? As I've talked about before, unfortunately, in the United States, a lot of exposure points have financial price tags tied to them. That's problematic. When I was going to school, public education provided a lot of exposure opportunities for us for zero to minimal cost. And then I grew up in an Air Force-based environment where we had a lot of co-curricular opportunities for exposure and to kind of dibble and dabble in a range of different items, subjects, organizations, whatever the case may be. But in today's society, you often need resources to expose your children. But that is kind of the reality. Once you identify what they're interested in, it's definitely important to then support that, because what we expose them to is inherently tied to what they become. And the inverse is true. The inverse is true. What we don't have the opportunity to expose them to, it may be a talent, but it'll be one of those things unmanifested, right? You know, how many great people out there that have in them to be the premier, the best of, right? But for whatever reason and circumstance, they just weren't able to get to it. But do what we can as parents, glean, particularly in the STEM space, as a way of supporting young people of color in those spaces. Glean for math aptitude at a very young age. And once you discover it, then plug them in any way that you can. So that's a tip. That's a strategy. The dinner table conversations, the little fun play and banter that can occur there is a wonderful thing. It creates long-time memories for them, but it's also a way to connect, to observe, and to support your beautiful seed's growth. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. If you have any thoughts or comments or strategies, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll stay here a little bit. Again, I don't know who's with us, but it's good to see you all. Tomorrow's session with J4 Conversations will be about things your children ought to be exposed to that and have some, and to be relatively decent at it, right? things that all young people, it would help them socially to have some exposure to it, some confidence in doing it, and some familiarity with it. So we're going to do a two-rounder around things your children or your sons or daughters ought to be exposed to and pretty decent at by the time they're 18 years old. All right. Beautiful family. It's good to see you guys. Appreciate y'all joining me here for a J4 conversation. Expose your children, but determine what they like, what they enjoy, what their talents are as a basis of what you then expose them to. And at some point that will have to narrow. It's kind of a machine gun approach in the beginning, but once they kind of gravitate in certain kind of ways, and as long as they're enjoying it, I'm not talking pressure parent situation, as long as they're enjoying it, then begin to support that. Because you'll go from macro opportunities of exposure, gleaning interest, and then you got to make financial choices, you got to make time choices, you got to make resource choices, and then you'll begin to, then you as a family will begin to narrow and hone in. And then by the time they've graduated from high school and are getting ready to make post-high school choices, whether it's career, profession, entrepreneurialism, or jobs, they will have done that from a place of previous exposure to their passion point or their talent set. All right. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate y'all joining in for the J4 conversations. Much love. Take care.